Hello, everyone, and welcome back to NeuroSpicy at Work Season 2. It's in truly NeuroSpicy fashion that the last season ended a little bit without warning from all our points of view. We've decided to be agile and go with the flow and allow our team a lot more time off over the holidays than we initially planned. So the episode with Chris Stone you heard was the last one of Season 1. Welcome to Season 2, where the next episodes are going to tackle even bigger topics around neurodivergence, the workplace, our role in society, and the way that each of us have arrived at being where we are in terms of acceptance and in terms of needs that we're now recognizing as neurospicy individuals at work. A lot more surprises, including a potential big collaboration that I am excited to talk to you about. But above all, listen to the next episode that is featuring Craig Cockburn, who is a delightful guest that has spoken about his personal experience, his hyperfocus on various academical topics, and the way he sees the world today. Enjoy. Craig Cockburn is someone whose name is quite reverberant in the Agile community. He is a conference speaker, an Agile strategist. He has been a delivery specialist and really someone who has taught leadership and leads of transformation how to do things right for many, many years. Not only that, but he is an award-winning innovator and someone who has been through an incredibly colorful journey. Some of this journey is discussed here in this episode. You're going to hear about Craig's academic journey as well as the things that he's observing in the world today, a world that can use more adaptation and a world that isn't exactly built for those of us that are neurospicy. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to NeuroSpicy at Work. I have Craig Cockburn with us today. You've seen and heard the little intro I've done before, so you know we're in for a treat. Thank you for accepting my invite, Craig.
It's great to be here.
Yes, we were hoping that we can hear quite a bunch of things from yourself. I don't even know really where to start. I am a big fan of your work in the Agile community. I've been following your thoughts for quite a while, and I was excited to hear that you'd be willing to speak about this side of things. So, first question: are you someone who would consider themselves neurodivergent, and if so, is there a diagnosis, and have you ever looked for one?
Well, I haven't ever really looked for one. And it's funny, this really. When I look back, I go, yeah, it's a spectrum, and there's some that are very much more on one end than the other. We don't really quite know where normal ends and where special adjustments come in. It's going to be specific to the individual. Looking back, there's maybe some hints that was perhaps tending towards that neurodivergent sort of thing, but it's never been so much of a hindrance or hampering me that I felt I needed some sort of medical support, intervention, or diagnosis. I've just really carried on with my life, and yeah, occasionally there's some things that I find just excessively difficult, like remembering people's names. And, you know, when I was into singing, remembering song lyrics, that was like really hard work. But there's other things that have been a big advantage, and I was quite analytical. I did particularly well in school, and also extracurricular hobbies I had at school, which was solving Rubik's Cube. And there was this tendency to just dive deeper and study things much more than perhaps would be expected, even in primary school. And then, you know, I went on and got a postgraduate degree with class medal and distinction. And it's kind of like this intensity actually played to an advantage often. So it's just like, yeah, I was probably a little bit different, but didn't really think about it in that area of, well, is this ADHD or is it autism or is it anything else like that? It just didn't really come to mind. And it's only really been in the last few years that I've been much more aware of this. You know, my wife being a special needs teacher, works in special education, so she's very much working on children that have really a disability with their autism and behavioural issues. So it's like, yeah, there's this huge spectrum of which perhaps most adults that we encounter are in a limited section of it. And really it's through working with the neurodiverse community, because I worked with the British Computer Society, initially helping to set up and stand in their committee for neurodiverse individuals and worked with people with diagnoses. And it's very interesting seeing some things that are similar and some things that are different.
Very cool. But if you had to pick one, and you said you would self-diagnose, would you say that there's a touch of ADHD? Would you say you're more classically autistic? Any of those? Did you feel
I
affiliation to?
suppose without sort of trying to self-diagnose, I would say, yeah, I maybe have a short attention span. I've complained about certain things that would perhaps annoy people with ADHD, like excessive noise in supermarkets and things that are just similar to that.
Right.
Now, it was a few years ago, somebody thought I might have Asperger's. I know that term's not used anymore, but then I bought a book and I went, I can see some similarities there.
Right.
But at the same time, it's not really causing me a problem, so why should I bother? It's just like that. So
makes sense. So that's why you never thought to go look for it formally, and I can completely understand why most of us don't go that route, and it feels like much more trouble than the gains of it. So yes, Asperger is indeed.
I feel like if you're struggling with something or finding it difficult to cope, then I could understand that sort of diagnosis would greatly be beneficial. So of course, I'm not discouraging anybody from trying to get a diagnosis, and appreciate from talking to people, especially women, how difficult that can be.
Right. And this is a good point you've touched on. Asperger's is no longer accepted as a diagnosis, and yet there is a plethora of people out there who have had that as a label at one point in their lives. So I do expect that, and I know from talking to people on the spectrum that they have been kind of left hanging, going, well, what is it then, and how do I fit in? And that's probably something that ideally the community is going to come around to find better places for. But I like that we started directly delving into how neurodivergence, whether it has a diagnosis or not, whether it has a label or not, is and can be an asset. So you were speaking about hyper interest and how potentially being able to be super interested in something for a length of time has served you over your life. So do you want to give us a couple of examples of that?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. So I suppose maybe even in primary school was a couple of things. I mean, started reading books, getting into like what's going on space travel, reading a little bit about atomic theory, which was a bit weird for being in primary school, right? And also the pocket calculator just come out, and I was experimenting with that. They were a bit odd back then. Some of them worked in inverse Polish notation, so I mastered that. And then I started sort of learning numbers like pi to 25 decimal places, and the value of e 2.7182818 and 3.141596535 and so on. And just like my mind had an ability to just suck numbers in and store them. And it's like I didn't quite understand that I was actually different to other people, other than just I had this interest, particularly in numbers and science and processing information and trying to just solve puzzles. And, so that was in primary school. I was perhaps a little bit more self-educated and taking a motivational interest in my own education. And, also, see, my watch is normally in my right hand because I'm left-handed. So, and the teachers at the school were quite backwards. They didn't really like left-handed people, and they taught me to try and write like a right-handed person. That didn't work. So I had to teach myself how to write. These sorts of things. And what sort of then happened when I went to high school was I wasn't a sort of particularly standout pupil. I was like, and it was very interesting how this played out. In that, I remember it was at one point in probably about fifth year of high school, I got about 45% in an English exam and 95% in a maths exam. And the English teacher just couldn't understand why I was so good at one subject and so terrible at another. But the funny thing was with the English is that she gave us a book to read. And I went, this book's amazing. And I finished it off and then bought the sequel and the sequel. And she says, oh, we're not doing that book anymore. And I went, but it's brilliant, right? So it's like, when I'm really motivated to do something, I really get into it and I do it and great. And if I'm not motivated to do it, it's a big turn off. Right. And it's just like, it's very hard to maintain focus, concentration, or even just on a level of alertness. It's almost like the brain goes, this is boring, and just switching right off. Right. And so what happened, and this then was perhaps the first example at school of saying, look, I'm just going to set myself a goal and do it. And I went to Dunblane High School. It was the same school that Andy Murray is from, Dunblane, Scotland. And it's a very good state school. It consistently ranks as one of the top 10 in Scotland. And they'd never in their history, and they weren't that old when I joined, so this isn't a big history, but they never in their history had a pupil that had got more than 85% in a higher exam. That's the exam that you do to get to university in Scotland back then. And so I thought, well, that's my goal then. I'm just going to do that. And so in maths, I was never in the top sort of 5. I was in the top 10%. I thought, I'm just going to set myself a goal to do that. And I did it. And I not just got over 85%, I got over 90%. So it was the first over 90% mark in the history of the school in any subject in one of the top schools in Scotland. And that's a sign of, I'm just relentlessly going to focus on doing this thing, set myself the goal and do it. Which was interesting because it set up a whole load of subsequent then events. The school then wanted me to go on to Oxford and Cambridge, and I ended up going to Edinburgh. But then at Edinburgh, it was the opposite. This is far too theoretical, and I'm actually quite practical. And so I hated the subjects at Edinburgh University, even though it was still maths. The maths became too theoretical, and I was massively turned off by it. Although I did artificial intelligence and then got a merit in that. But I really, really, really struggled with that degree because my mind just could not appreciate and understand it and like it enough. It delved way off into the theory, and so I really struggled. Then I went to, I started my first job. I was in there for a few years, got made redundant, and then went back to university again to further my career prospects. And this time I was very careful about choosing something I was really interested in. And again, I went from really struggling with my undergraduate degree to then doing my postgraduate degree and getting the class medal and distinction. So you can see this massive swing between I'm really interested, motivated in this, and I break all the records almost. You know, people were still referring to my thesis 10 years later. And at the same time, when it's not something I'm genuinely interested in, I really struggle to maintain that level of alertness and awakeness and interest and energy levels to keep me going. And that's I suppose, the sort of balance that I struggle the most with, you know.
Right.
And again, later on, when I was finishing a really period of really ill health, I started a postgraduate diploma that was 6 months. And there was 120 of us on that. And again, I got another class medal and another distinction. So it's like, when I'm really into it, and almost when there's a bit of competitiveness going on as well, right? You know, yeah, great marks. And when I'm not, it's just like, I've just got to really force myself to kind of get going.
I think this is a really important point, and I'd like to make that very clear because we hear a lot in the community the criticism from the neurotypical side of things, where the objection is obviously if you're not motivated, you're not going to be doing something willingly. We all have that problem. And I'd like to make this very clear for people listening. There is a marked difference between not being able to focus on a subject due to a lack of chemical in your brain and being unwilling to do so because it's not quite fun. The difference is that of course you can still force yourself and excel in something if you must and if you're under duress or if you set yourself a goal, but it doesn't make it half as accessible as it would be to someone who has enough of the required chemical in their brain to keep that attention span for something that they're not interested in. So yes, it's in common with across the universal human spectrum, whether or not you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, but the lack of motivation for someone who has ADHD or is neurodivergent is debilitating, and it isn't something that can be overcome for many people. It is why some people are on medication. It is why some people have to have adaptation of different sorts. So kind of reducing it, yes, we all have motivation issues and we all like some things more than others, is genuinely not kind and not useful to anyone. So I really like that you had really good examples of the fact that once we do become hyper interested in something, that capability of holding focus for enough time to gather knowledge is crucial.
Yeah, the other thing that was actually different is that, having been in industry, I'd learned the skills of structure, which is absolutely critical. Now, the big leap, of course, when I went from high school to university, it's a totally different, much more self-directed learning environment. as well as, of course, having to live by yourself and organise the house and pay bills and travel and all that stuff. I just didn't have those skills. Whereas when I'd been in industry and come back, I definitely had those skills. And what I noticed the big difference was I would set myself a timetable from a postgrad. I would say, right, I'm going to go to the university for 8 hours, do an 8-hour day as if it's a full-time job, do my study, maybe do extra hours as well, do all these extra things. Whereas before, in an undergraduate, it's like, so the journey to university on my bike is about 20 minutes, and I'd leave the door at like 20 minutes to. And it's like, my timekeeping was just not great. I'd just assume I'd get there, and of course I'd arrive and I'd be out of breath, but I never really reflect and improve. I go, that wasn't a good experience, was it? Why didn't you give yourself 10 minutes more the next day? But somehow my brain just couldn't get into that level of being prepared and organised such that everything is orderly and laid out. It all just felt like I couldn't kind of motivate myself to act in the moment at the right time to prevent that sort of issue. Now, I was never really late, but the idea of being super early was just not a thing. It's like, so it's funny how maybe even just experience of industry and skills learning actually helped me to cope and deal with that.
Right, and this is a good point. As we went through life and as our experiences have accumulated, of course, that has helped us create adaptation networks that will best fit the way that our executive function works, the way that our deeper thought process works, and of course that makes it easier. But that still doesn't take away that it sometimes takes a lot more effort for us to get into certain patterns than it would for people who would come natural to. So walk us through
that thing about more effort is perfectly valid. It's like, yes, I can do it. It's just my learning curve is different and it takes much longer. It needs to be conscious, and it might even need to be in a different way that I'm taught that particular thing. I've often thought, and my wife being a teacher, she shows me how the methods are for teaching children, and go, well, fine, you've got to impose this one way of teaching on people, but actually it's often better for the person to find it for themselves what way works the best. As I found in school, me teaching myself actually worked hugely successfully for me. And that's been my sort of story in life. It's just trying to work out what works for me rather than just assuming that the default way is the universal way.
This is actually a really good point that I very rarely touch on this podcast, and I should. The way that neurodivergent people approach learning is very diverse. Obviously, it's very different for everyone. And indeed, that is a really good point that you've brought up. If we want people to have more access to education, we have to find a lot more customized ways of presenting information to them. And if only schools and systems around the world would be slightly more intelligent and had more resources. A lot of it is not necessarily lack of knowledge, but an inability of having customized educational tracks and programs for everyone that needs it differently. I see this firsthand in many ways. I've had autistic children myself, and I'm now half homeschooling my little one, and the difference between me explaining something to him related to the amount of attention that he can give me with my spidey senses as a mom, whether or not he's engaged, versus him pretending he's engaged and masking to someone else in school, is night and day. So if only we had that type of support at all times, it would be better.
Yeah, and it's about finding the way that works. Because when you get that, it's fabulous. I mean, I find that when I'm sitting down to write a conference talk, I can't just sit down and just focus. It's more, and I say, well, I've talked about focus already, but something like that, I'm like, it's like I'm holding so many ideas in my head at the same time. I've got to write them down, and then I do a little bit, and then after about 20 minutes, I'll just get tired, and then I've got to pull away, and then I've got to do something else, and then I come back to it. So when I did my most recent conference talk in September, it really took me a good month of these little bits, because too much was just tiring me out and I was getting bored, and then coming back with fresh thoughts and fresh ideas, and that more incremental approach, which takes longer, but actually I think produces a better product. And the other thing about educational learning is that I just wish that sometimes we would just look around and learn what actually works. I mean, one of the things that I observed is I used to go to conferences. I went more before COVID and still go to them. But my observation about conferences is that terrific content, terrific speakers, You learn, you network, and everything else. But it was a bit like that analogy of when I was at Edinburgh University, it was a struggle. The people had PhDs, the people were brilliant. It was one of the leading centres of computing in Britain, if not the world. They just weren't very good teachers, right? And there's a difference between knowing your stuff and teaching it. And when I went to a conference, particularly if it was like maybe 3 days, after each day I'd go, how much did I really learn? And the difficulty is that, first of all, these people are not actually trained speakers. They're great at their subject matter, but they're not trained in the way of a TED speaker might be, or a professional teacher might be. And then you're going to talk after talk after talk after talk. And although the conference went to tremendous lengths to cater for neurodiversity by having, say, a quiet room and a working room and different types of environment where you could go to chill out and whatever suited you, at the end it was like, it was probably about 8 talks, all presented in a different format. And after 3 days of that, I'd go, I'm exhausted, right? And whether you had a diagnosis or not, I think a lot of actual people without a diagnosis or not on the spectrum actually felt the same and go, surely there's a better way than this. So that we take 3 days out of our work, spend that time learning and figure out a way of maximizing how much content we can actually remember afterwards and then go off and implement. Otherwise, it's a bit of a waste of money, other than the great networking and the social activities, right? So it's like, so this then led me, after I'd done my first talk, to say, how can I structure this talk in a better or different or more visual format, which then led me into more research around neurodiversity, which then led me to then change the talk and then give a talk on effectively how to give a talk. And when I was doing the research for that, I looked at things like TED and went, they've got books on this. They talk about things like have a structure, have a format, take people on a story, lead off with this, and have that structure. And also you've got to respect quite a strict time box and go, even if you just made that format visible, it would prevent people like me sitting in a talk going, well, we're like 10, 15 minutes in, and I don't even know where we're at or where we're going or what part of the talk we're supposed to be in. If you had a book, you'd see which chapter you were in, right? So it's like, what I did was then present a sort of visual format for a speaker or somebody attending to at least make this real, to say, we're here, we're going to go there, this is roughly how the talk's laid out, not just in terms of content, but in terms of time boxes. And when we've covered each time box and section, we'll do a short visual recap to remind you and put it up there. And then at the end of the talk, I put all that information up. So you've got the talk in summary format, and you can have that available when you're then asking questions. So that you don't have to then think back to what was said then. You've actually got it in front of you. So again, I'm facilitating that cognitive load to reduce the cognitive load. And therefore people don't then get so tired. And it just to me felt like an obvious thing, because one of the things that I feel like I'm good at is saying, this is a problem, let's figure out the solution. And all, my life I've come up with great ideas to solutions, but it's incredibly frustrating trying to launch a startup when no one else gets it, or it's too early for the market to figure it out, which is why I'm kind of listed in Wikipedia as having invented an early browser. The people around me just didn't get it. Or I invented a job board and got in the newspapers in 1989. People didn't get what that was. It was 5 years before one launched. And it's very frustrating being creative to find the answers to genuine problems that affect millions, and then trying to articulate it in a way and get the support and people around you that can then take that forward into a proper product or solution. That's been one of my biggest frustrations in life, right?
I love that. I think we should keep out of that, taking your advice. The fact that having a visual roadmap and a reminder of where you are in the course of what you're presenting as information is not only a kind adaptation for neurodiverse people, but across the board useful for anyone in terms of lessening cognitive load.
Yeah.
And I don't think it necessarily only applies to conferences. I'm a keynote speaker myself, and I like to do that because I know the power of it. That's why I was a big fan of Prezi back in the day. If you remember, it was able to get us in and out of the visuals of where the presentation was going. But I think we should take that outside of just the realm of giving long pieces of information and bring it into the workplace. And we know as facilitators, and we have to find ways that everyone in the room gets what we're trying to say. So of course we'll do that. But I think people who are not very adept at doing it might be missing it in meetings, for instance. It's only very recently, really, that the tech world has gotten around to giving an agenda before and a synopsis after, and AI is greatly helping with that. But if anyone listening to this is not doing it, absolutely go check out what Craig's summary of the method was and apply that to your own meetings, because you'll see a marked improvement in talking to your teammates, I think. Would you say that's
so
useful
that's the talk.
in
The
facilitate?
talk on the knowledge. So that talk was called the Knowledge Canvas, and apart from helping the people who are attending, it also helps the speaker, right? Because I became aware when researching this that the mind maps are really an advantageous thing, particularly in the neurodiverse community. I mean, I get it, and they're useful, and this sort of writing things down and visualizing, it sort of helps to foster the connections in the brain for memory. Fabulous, right? I'm not taking away from that at all. But I just figured that for a linear thing like a talk, a thing that wasn't linear, MinMap, didn't really fit, so, which is why I made it linear. And then by making it linear and maybe even color-coded, you can start by saying, well, this is a talk, and this is roughly how long I want to spend on each part of the story. And then at the top, you then write the key takeaways or the key topics. So you're highlighting the summary of each section. And then when you've got the summary, you've kind of got the backbone of the talk. So with that backbone in place, you can then say, in order to get that summary, what's the supporting points and arguments you want to make? So then you're filling out the rest of the canvas in line with that backbone, and it fills itself out. And so you're not overloading with too much stuff, which is one of the problems I face when I'm writing a talk, is there's so much I could write about, but I've only got 40 minutes. So it helps you kind of constrain what you think is genuinely important, because the box is only so big for only so much stuff.
Right. I love that. And thank you for actually clarifying it, because people can take a lot of practical advice out of that. And as I said, you can go and find out more about the actual, you have it published, right? They can find it on YouTube, is it?
Yeah. So it's on my YouTube, and it's one of my conference talks. And what I did was, having then done the talk on that as a subject, I then applied that method to my previous talk to then use the format in the talk. So when I was doing this, it was it was then my first conference talk in 2019. I was aware I was covering a lot of ground in 40 minutes. I was like complexity theory and politics and all sorts of things and product roadmaps. And there's a ton of stuff in there. And I was somehow found a way to blend it all together and make it connect. But I realized that this was quite a cognitive load on people to kind of take all that in such a short space of time. So then I went and applied the structured format to it. And then at each point in that talk, I then introduced the graphic format. And people said, this is really cool. And I saw a lot of people commenting on it to go, I've never seen anybody do this before. It's really useful. I mean, fabulous. I mean, the first time I did the talk in the visual format, people went off and implemented it the very next day. I went, that's unheard of, to have such clear, actionable, original content that people find it immediately useful.
Very cool. Very, very cool. And I think, I don't know how clear this is for anyone listening to us, and maybe people are not quite on LinkedIn as much as listening to this on a podcast, but Craig is in an industry where unless we make the very complex and very volatile clear, we have no chance of moving ahead. We talk about this concept of agility, which, in technology and in business just means you do things in a very different way than the sequential thinking that other people have. So unless we have a chance of really appealing to people with the big complex topics we're presenting, then there's no way that they're going to come along on a very complicated journey. So I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, the skill of a teacher is to make complex simple, basically, so that people can understand it without talking down to them. But, there's a cyber professor just down there at the university, and he's like super geeky and ultra clever. But he's such a brilliant teacher that people like me who don't have a background in cyber can just look at his lectures and his talks and go, yeah, I can follow this. It's really well told and well explained. There's like minimal jargon. It's going at the right pace, and you introduce the concepts in a sensible way.
Sounds so simple, but it is exactly why it's elusive to people. Well, thank you. That is really useful. So, in terms of a silly question that I tend to ask anyone who is in technology, who is a guest on this podcast, would you say that there is a that the way I formulate this might be leading, and I wouldn't want to, but would you say that there's a higher prevalence of neurodiverse people in the technology field than other fields?
Well, I think so. I mean, it's difficult not having a lot of comparative data, but in the community I'm in, I see a lot of people talking about neurodiversity. And when I suppose after about 2018 was doing coaching as a full time rather than just now and again, I noticed that it was coming up more and more to the fore that people were talking about it, which is why I became more interested in it, that people had a diagnosis or they talked about it or they related their experiences of it. And so I'm just much more aware now of people with neurodiversity around me and the experiences that they've had, which has sometimes been quite an issue and a problem, and particularly for women, it's harder to get a diagnosis. There's obviously a lot of men that were more straightforward and open about it and perhaps were aware. And I don't know how that really compares to other industries, but when I'm working in agile coaching, it's not quite so technical as, say, working in cyber or in programming, although some of them have come from a more programming background. Agile coaching is much more rounded, which is working with people and getting effectiveness and efficiency and the best out of teams and such like. And I was more attracted to that because I feel like it was a rounder, more holistic experience. But the act of being an agile coach is wanting to get the best out of your team, and that includes people who are neurodiverse, which was another motivating reason for being interested in it, so I can support my team better and facilitate sessions in the right way to include people who might feel overloaded or want to contribute differently or don't feel comfortable over interrupting and so on. So that process of just being in that space made me much more aware of it. I don't know how that compares to other industries, but it would be really interesting to see if neurodiverse people are actually particularly drawn to a particular profession in some way.
That's an interesting one, and I wouldn't want to go into the weeds of it because we would need a few hours of debating it, whether or not, the individual contributor versus the need for teaming and for pair programming and for communication that's inbuilt in agility is something that is of clear awareness across the board. It's a really vast topic, and I know both you and I write about it a lot. So I encourage anyone that's listening to this to actually get on your LinkedIn and read some of the things you're saying. But fun fact, and one of the latest fights you've taken as an advocate for neurodiversity. Do you want to talk us through the supermarket debacle a little bit?
Oh yes. So this was earlier in the year, and I went into my local supermarket, and I was just aware they were playing really loud music. To me, it seemed loud anyway. I thought, and rather than just letting it lie, of course, it's like grab it with both hands, as I was doing like in school and in high school, going, I'm going to do something about this. So I just stood there in the supermarket and filmed. I was careful not to film anyone else, but I just like filmed the food on the shelf. And because I was doing this video, you could then hear the music above it. I mean, obviously, if I pointed the phone straight at the speaker, that would be a bit biased. But I then hang on a second, and commented in a couple of Facebook groups, and a reporter picked up on it. And I just felt it was just too loud. And once you start getting into a subject, a whole lot of new information then just emerges. Of course, it was several years prior to this that I was working up north, and the Sainsbury's up there. This was in 2017. Had a neurodiverse hour or something on where it was a bit darker and there was no noise. I wasn't so aware of all that then, so it sort of passed me by. But then I thought back and said, "Oh, I sort of get it now," and it made me aware that the supermarket was then complaining about it had this music, and then had suggested. Then I'd decided to say, well, in order to be inclusive, we're going to have, I think it was like Thursday morning at 9:00 will be quiet, and Saturday morning at 9:00 will be quiet. And go, well, hang a second, you're just sort of admitting it's uninclusive the rest of the time, and you're only choosing to be inclusive for 2 hours a week. That's not acceptable. So to me, that's like saying, imagine a supermarket with steps out the front, and then saying, we'll put a ramp out for people in wheelchairs 2 hours a week. If people were to do that, it would be a scandal, right? But somehow for neurodiverse, it seems to be acceptable in the eyes of the supermarket because they're more interested in marketing and loud messages. And it's not just about neurodiversity, although that's a really important part of it. It's about the fact that, if I'm shopping with elderly relatives and they're hard of hearing, they find it difficult to differentiate over loud noise. Or if parents are going with children, as my wife pointed out, the music can excite them and get them all up and going and want to dance around and be a nuisance. That makes it harder for the parents to control the children. And even more inappropriately, this particular supermarket was the closest supermarket to a special needs school where there's autistic and ADHD children very much needing special education because of their diversity and their disabilities. And they were then going to the supermarket afterwards with their parents who were wanting to do shopping after school with their kids. And so it was like really an inappropriate place and an inappropriate thing. And I just went, why are we having to put up with this? And it's not obviously universal that every supermarket has live music, so it's not essential for buying stuff. It just seemed to be a thing that they were doing. So I ended up in the papers talking about neurodiversity and inclusion, and they published this article on it. Now, nothing much has changed.
I was
but
going
whenever
to
this
ask,
now
anything
comes
changed
up,
now?
no. However, what I've now done is to say, look, every time I go in there, rather than repeatedly taking time out of my shop to go to customer service and talk about it, which becomes frankly annoying, whenever I'm at the checkout and just finishing up, I just say, the music was really loud today, can you just turn it down the next time? So every time I go, they're getting the same message. And funnily, what happened is that this was a few weeks ago. One of the tellers said to me backwards, said, yeah, loads of people are complaining about that.
That's interesting.
As a teller, she found it difficult herself. So whether she was neurodiverse or not, but as a place of work, your workplace must be inclusive too. So let's consider it from the point of view of somebody who's there all day, being tired out and having to talk over loud music as well. It's just inconsiderate. And she said that she was thinking of leaving to go and work in a totally different field of work. I think it was like a law office or somewhere, but obviously they wouldn't be loud music. So it's not only uninclusive for the customer, it's uninclusive for the employees too.
Right.
But nothing has changed. And I just go, it does get a bit tiresome making the same point over and over. But then I went into another couple of shops and they were just exactly the same. It's just like, obviously the head of marketing has decided to plug Supermarket Radio Limited and just shove the message out. But you look at it in the shop and go, nobody's actually listening to this, are they? There's no data. When I worked at Tesco, there was loads of data. You must have the data to show that this works. Show it to us. Or have a feedback section at the supermarket exit where customers can give you feedback on their experience in the shop, and then you will learn what works and doesn't. Because me commenting to 20,000 people on social media is probably not what you want to be happening.
Right, exactly that. And, this is a really good example. To some, it might sound like a small thing and it might sound like it's anecdotal, but it is an example of when real life lack of adaptation is always there and we just assume it should be the norm and we don't stop to think what is best and whether or not that's useful for the business and whether or not that places the brand of the business any better. And yes, indeed, they would do well to start checking their data. But thank you for taking that fight. I think it's useful to
the effect
remember.
on me is not huge, but I can understand that the effect on other people will be quite considerable. But the effect on me is, if I'm trying to hold things in my head and remember them at the shop, it's harder to remember them because there's this distraction going on, because I'm too focused on the distraction, which is what happens, right? And also even just when I'm trying to concentrate on doing something like self-checkout or maybe do it the wrong way, because again, I don't have that power of concentration because there's this thing disturbing my concentration.
Right. So again, it doesn't really mean that it's across the board for everyone, but there are small parts of life, and I would encourage anyone listening to this to try and keep their eye out for other examples like that, because there are many around where we just got used to living a certain way that is designed for a very neurotypical world where those things would not be bothersome. And the more we can bring them up, then the more we can change around us. So I really appreciate that. And thank you so much for giving us some of your story. We are running out of time a little bit. Like I said, I know that people don't have the attention spans to hold on to this podcast for more than 30 something minutes. But I would like to have you back at some point and hopefully talk about what is it like in the industries that you've seen over your very rich career, and what are some of the pluses and the minuses of being on the side of life and of thinking that we are at. But thank you so much for today.
I've certainly been relating neurodiversity to remote working because that's been a huge area that people are talking about, and it's clearly got big advantages for neurodiversity too. So, but maybe that's a topic for another day, right? It's a whole field in itself.
Yes, it's a big one, but thank you for bringing it up, because indeed, remembering that neurodiversity is an asset in many ways is what we're trying to land with this podcast, and just having people here, successful individuals who are themselves neurodiverse, talking about their experience like you have done today with us, thank you, is what we're aiming for. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll get you back at some point soon.
That'd be great. Thanks very much then.
Bye.
Bye.